guilt isn't always what you think it is. There's a version of it that makes sense, the kind that arrives when you've done something wrong, when you've hurt someone, when you owe a person an apology you haven't given. That guilt is clean, it has a shape, it points to something specific. But there's another kind, and you know the one I mean. It arrives when everything is going well. It shows up on a Tuesday morning when you wake up and nothing is wrong, when the relationship is stable and the work is meaningful and the day ahead is genuinely fine. And instead of feeling the ease you've worked toward, you feel this low, sourceless dread. This sense that you don't quite deserve the ground you're standing on, that something is about to go sideways because things have been too good for too long, that you should be doing more, giving more, worrying more, because if you're not suffering at least a little, you're probably not doing enough. Be honest with yourself for a second. You've gotten good news and felt nothing. Or felt it briefly, then immediately started looking for the catch. You've had someone tell you they're proud of you and deflected it so fast you didn't even let it land. You've achieved something you worked for, genuinely worked for, and spent the next week wondering who was going to figure out that you didn't really deserve it. That's not gratitude practice. That's not humility. That's guilt. And it's sitting right in the middle of the life you've been building. Carl Jung spent decades sitting across from people who felt exactly this. Patients who came to him not because their lives were in ruins, but because their lives were going well, and they couldn't bear it. Jung documented the pattern so precisely, across so many cases, that it changed how he thought about guilt entirely. He stopped treating it as a response to wrongdoing. He started treating it as a structure, a psychological architecture that some people carry so deeply, they can't receive good things without immediately trying to give them back. If that sentence just landed somewhere specific, stay with this. Here's what makes this particular guilt so confusing. It doesn't feel like guilt, not the way guilt normally does. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't say you did something wrong. It comes disguised as responsibility, as conscientiousness, as the reasonable awareness that you shouldn't get too comfortable, shouldn't want too much, shouldn't take up too much space in the story of your own life. It feels like maturity. Jung called the part of the psyche responsible for this the superego's shadow function, a concept he developed most fully in his clinical notebooks and his work on the psychology of the unconscious. The shadow, for Jung, wasn't only the dark or rejected parts of the self. It was everything that had been deemed unacceptable by the environment you were shaped in. And in certain environments, certain families, certain cultures, certain relational systems, receiving good things was unacceptable. Wanting good things was unacceptable. Feeling ease or joy or satisfaction without immediately tempering it with worry or diminishment was unacceptable. The child who grew up in that environment didn't stop wanting. They just learned to punish themselves for wanting. And by the time they were adults, the punishment had become automatic, invisible, so seamlessly woven into the texture of their daily experience that it stopped feeling like punishment and started feeling like who they were. You don't notice the guilt because it's not sitting on top of the good news. It's underneath it. It's the reason the good news never quite lands. Let me make this specific, because the abstract version of this is easy to agree with and hard to actually see in yourself. You get a raise, real recognition, real money, the thing you've been working toward for 2 years. And somewhere in the first 48 hours, you start thinking about whether you've been working hard enough lately, whether you've really earned it the way someone else might have earned it, whether the person who gave it to you will eventually realize they made a mistake, or the relationship you've been building is genuinely good. The person you're with is kind and present and they see you clearly, and instead of resting in that, you find yourself waiting, monitoring the edges of it, looking for the first sign that they're going to change, or leave, or reveal the version of themselves you were apparently supposed to have known was coming. Or it's smaller than that. Someone you respect tells you something you made was good, and you nod and say thank you and change the subject, because staying in that moment for any longer than 2 seconds feels uncomfortably close to something you can't quite name. Jung noted in patient after patient that this pattern had a specific origin. It didn't come from nowhere. It wasn't a personality trait or a character flaw or evidence of some fundamental unworthiness. It came from a relational system, usually early, usually family, sometimes a broader cultural container that had communicated in ways both explicit and atmospheric that good things are conditional. That ease must be justified. That joy requires a companion sacrifice, or it doesn't count. That the right way to receive something good is to immediately prove you understand you might not deserve it. The child absorbed this as truth, not consciously, not through a decision, through repetition, through the felt sense, accumulated over years of what it was safe to feel and what it wasn't. And now you're an adult, and the system is gone, but the feeling it installed is still running. I had a friend who got into the graduate program she'd been working toward for 3 years. First person in her family to do it. The kind of thing that should have felt enormous. She called me the evening she found out, and she was flat. Not sad, not exhausted, just flat. She said, "I feel like I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop." And I asked her, "What other shoe?" And she went quiet. And after a moment she said, "I don't know. There's just always another shoe." There wasn't another shoe. The news was just good. But she'd spent so long in a relational system where good things came with conditions attached, where celebration felt dangerous, where expressing joy out loud was a kind of hubris that invited punishment, that she'd stopped being able to tell the difference between genuine wariness and the internalized voice telling her she didn't get to feel. This, Jung would have recognized her immediately. He would have named what she was carrying, and he would have been specific about where it came from, and he would have said something that I think is the most important reframe in this entire conversation. The guilt is not information about whether you deserve this. It's information about where you came from. And the terrible efficiency of it is that it doesn't need the original environment to be present anymore. The environment is gone. The people who communicated that good things were conditional, they may be gone too, or changed, or completely unaware of what they passed on. It doesn't matter. The nervous system stored the lesson, and the nervous system delivers it faithfully, every time the conditions are right, without checking whether the lesson still applies. This is something Jung observed with particular clarity in his work on what he called the feeling-toned complex, a cluster of memories, emotions, and learned responses that activates automatically in specific situations. You don't decide to feel guilty when good things happen. The complex fires. The feeling arrives, and because the feeling is so familiar, so integrated into your sense of who you are, you interpret it as accurate rather than automatic. The distinction matters enormously. An accurate feeling carries real information about the present moment. An automatic feeling carries real information about the past, dressed up as the present. The guilt you feel when things go well is almost always automatic. It was learned in a specific context, encoded a specific lesson, and keeps firing because nothing has ever interrupted the circuit, not because the lesson is still true. Here's the version that shows up in relationships, because that's where it tends to be most costly. Someone who loves you tells you something good, not just a compliment, something that lands deeper, something that describes you accurately, sees you clearly, confirms something you've quietly hoped was real, and you deflect it. Not out of dishonesty, out of something that feels, in the moment, like protection, like humility, like the appropriate response to being seen too clearly. The deflection is the guilt in action. Its job, the job it was trained to do, is to prevent you from taking up too much space, from wanting too much, from receiving more than the system decided was your share. When someone offers you real recognition, the guilt fires immediately, and you redirect, and the person offering it watches you refuse what they were trying to give you, and both of you are left slightly diminished by the exchange. Jung would say, the inability to receive love is not a sign that you don't deserve it. It's a sign that you learned, somewhere early and formative, that receiving was dangerous, that the appropriate stance toward good things was caution, That gratitude required a companion apology. You're not broken. You're trained. And training, unlike character, can be changed. Here's what Jung actually found, and this is the part most people never reach, because they stop at the guilt and assume it means something about their worth. The guilt isn't a verdict. It's a habit. A learned psychological reflex that was useful once and has been running on automatic ever since. In his clinical work, Jung observed that people who carry this particular structure tend to share a specific history, not always the same circumstances, but the same underlying dynamic. They were raised in environments where their well-being was contingent, where the adults around them were either actively uncomfortable with the child's happiness or so overwhelmed by their own suffering that the child learned, intuitively, that flourishing was a kind of betrayal. You couldn't fully succeed when someone you loved was struggling. You couldn't fully receive when someone around you was in need. The appropriate response to good things was to minimize them, redirect them, make them small enough that they didn't feel like an indictment of everyone who didn't have them. That impulse is generous at its core. It comes from love, but love without boundaries, absorbed into the nervous system before the nervous system had the capacity to distinguish between appropriate care and self-erasure, becomes a structure that works against you for the rest of your life, unless you look at it directly. Jung used the concept of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you actually are rather than who your formative environment needed you to be, to describe what he believed the work required. Not the elimination of sensitivity, not the dismantling of care for others, but the recovery of the capacity to receive, to let good things land, to occupy the space of your own success without immediately shrinking it back down to a size your past can tolerate. It's harder than it sounds, because the shrinking is automatic, and what makes it particularly difficult is that the people who do this most thoroughly are often the most genuinely humble, the most genuinely caring, the least likely to be performing false modesty. The guilt feels true to them. The unworthiness feels accurate. They're not pretending they actually experience the good thing as somehow wrong, somehow unearned, somehow waiting to be taken back. In October of 1957, a phone call arrived at a small apartment in Paris. Albert Camus, 33 years old, a man who had survived poverty in colonial Algeria and tuberculosis and the full weight of the 20th century's worst ideas, answered it and learned he had won the Nobel Prize in Literature. By almost any external measure, it was unambiguous recognition. The committee called him the most penetrating chronicler of the human conscience in our time. His work had reached millions of readers. He was, at that moment, one of the most widely read writers alive. His response was to immediately tell a journalist that he wished the prize had gone to André Malraux instead. He spent days trying to explain to interviewers why he felt the recognition was misplaced. He wrote to his mother, the woman whose life of poverty and silence had shaped everything he'd ever written, and the letter contained less celebration than apology. He described the prize as something that had arrived too soon and too large for what he believed he deserved. The critics read this as political positioning, or performative modesty, or the natural discomfort of a private man suddenly thrust into an unwanted spotlight. Some of those things were true, but Jung would have read something else in it, the very structure we've been describing. Camus had grown up poor, in a culture that did not celebrate poor men who rose above their station without guilt. His mother was deaf and could barely read. His father had died in World War I when Camus was less than a year old. He had become, by his early 30s, everything his environment had suggested was unavailable to him. And rather than resting in that, rather than receiving the Nobel Prize as the confirmation of something real, he spent much of his public response trying to give it back, to redirect it, to make it smaller than it was, more shared than it was, more provisional than it was. Not because he was performing humility, because he genuinely could not let it land. There's something in that title, The First Man, that I keep returning to. Because Camus was, in the most literal sense, a first man, the first in his lineage to rise to that height. And what the unfinished manuscript reveals is that he spent the last years of his life trying to understand why that ascent felt so isolating, why the success that should have been a culmination kept presenting itself as a kind of abandonment, why he could write, with absolute clarity, about the dignity and resilience of the working poor, and yet couldn't reconcile that clarity with the fact of being someone those people now read from a distance. This is the paradox at the heart of success guilt when it comes from class ascent, from family ascent, from any kind of genuine upward movement through systems that weren't designed to let you pass. You carry the people you came from inside you, and when you move somewhere they couldn't follow, the guilt isn't only psychological, it has a social and cultural weight to it. It asks, what do you owe the life you left? What does it mean to flourish when the people who made you possible couldn't? Jung didn't have a clean answer to this. Nobody does. But he was clear about the wrong answer, which is to refuse to flourish, to collapse your success back down to a size that the past can recognize, to treat your own diminishment as a form of loyalty. That's not loyalty. That's guilt wearing loyalty's clothes. He died in a car accident in 1960, at 46. 3 years after the Nobel. He left behind an unfinished novel. Some people argue it was his most personal work about a man returning to the city of his childhood and trying to understand why success felt like grief. The title of that unfinished novel was The First Man. I want to stay with Camus for another moment, because there's something in his specific version of this that I think is more useful than the generic framework. He wasn't someone who believed he was worthless. He wasn't suffering from low self-esteem in any conventional sense. He was a man of enormous intellectual confidence who had thought more rigorously about the human condition than almost anyone of his generation. He was clear-eyed about the value of his work, in a way that wasn't false modesty. But he could not receive the prize without immediately thinking of his mother, who had cleaned other people's houses her entire life and could not read the books that bore his name. He could not experience his own success without it feeling, at some level, like an indictment of the people he loved, most people who had not had access to the doors that had opened for him. Jung would call this a form of survivor guilt, not the clinical post-trauma version, but something structurally similar. The guilt of the person who rose from a difficult system and can't fully inhabit their ascent because they're still, internally, standing in the system they came from, still calibrating their right to flourish against the suffering of the people they left behind, still asking unconsciously whether it's permitted to be this okay. The answer, by the way, is yes. Not because suffering doesn't matter, but because your collapse doesn't help the people who struggled. Your diminishment doesn't honor them. The only thing that honoring them requires, the only thing is to not waste what you were given. So what actually changes this? Jung was precise about this, and I want to be equally precise, because the vague answer is worse than no answer at all. The guilt doesn't change through positive thinking. It doesn't dissolve when you remind yourself of the things you're grateful for, or when you list your accomplishments, or when someone tells you that you deserve good things. Those things are fine. They're just not the mechanism. The mechanism is recognition, real recognition, not of the good thing, but of the system that made it feel impossible to receive. What Jung found, across case after case, is that the guilt begins to loosen when the person can name it with specificity. Not, I have trouble receiving compliments, everyone knows that about themselves, and it changes nothing. But there was a specific relational environment, with specific messages delivered by specific people I loved and depended on, that taught me that my flourishing came at a cost. And I learned that lesson so well that I'm still paying the cost, decades later, for good things that cost nothing. That's the recognition. And what it requires is not therapy, necessarily, though therapy can be the right container for it. What it requires is the willingness to trace the guilt back to its actual origin. Not to assign blame, not to relitigate the past, but to understand that the voice saying you don't deserve this is not your voice. It's an inherited voice. It belongs to a system, and the system is gone, even if the voice is still here. The voice quiets not overnight, Not completely, but meaningfully when you stop treating it as information and start treating it as weather. Something that happens in you without being about you. Something that passes through without being the truth. There's a piece of research here that I find more useful than almost anything else. And I want to be careful with how I say this because it's not a quick fix, it's more of an explanation. Antonio Damasio at the University of Southern California, working from his research on the relationship between emotion and decision-making, demonstrated that the brain doesn't experience the present moment neutrally. It experiences it through the lens of every comparable past experience. The brain is fundamentally a prediction machine. It takes incoming information and runs it through accumulated history to generate an expectation, and that expectation shapes the experience before it's even fully arrived. What this means for success guilt is specific and important. When good things happen, your brain doesn't evaluate them fresh. It routes them through every previous instance where good things arrived, and then got complicated, or conditional, or taken away. If that history is consistent enough, the prediction the brain generates is, this is going to cost something. And it generates that prediction before you've had a single conscious thought about whether this particular good thing is likely to cost anything at all. You're not being irrational. You're being very rational based on outdated data. The update doesn't happen through willpower. It doesn't happen through convincing yourself the data is wrong. It happens through the accumulation of new experiences where good things arrive and don't get complicated, where recognition lands and stays landed, where ease extends long enough that the brain finally begins to revise its prediction model. That's a slow process. And the most important thing you can do to support it is what Jung described as conscious encounter, deliberately staying with the good things slightly longer than the guilt wants you to. Not fighting the guilt, not trying to eliminate it, just not immediately obeying it, just introducing a pause between the automatic reflex and the automatic response. The pause is small. The effect, over time, is not. Here's the practical edge of this, because I don't want to leave you with only the psychological framework. The next time something good happens, not a major life event, just something small, something that you'd normally deflect or minimize or immediately redirect into worry, try something different. Try staying with it for slightly longer than is comfortable, not performing gratitude, not analyzing whether you deserve it, just letting the fact of it exist in you, unmodified, for 30 extra seconds. That's it, 30 seconds. It will feel strange. It might feel wrong. Something in you will want to move, to do something, to make the good thing earn its stay. That's the structure doing what it always does. You don't have to argue with it. You just don't have to immediately obey it. The great Jungian analyst Marion Woodman, who spent 40 years working with this exact pattern in her clinical practice, wrote that the capacity to receive is not passive. It is, she said, one of the most active and courageous things a person can do, because it requires holding the contradiction of being both someone who has struggled and someone who is allowed to be okay, both someone who comes from difficulty and someone who is permitted to have arrived somewhere different. That contradiction doesn't resolve. You don't get to reach a point where the guilt is gone and the ease is total and you never again feel the low-level dread of good things. What you get through this work is the ability to hold the contradiction without collapsing it. To let both things be true, the hardness of where you came from and the reality of where you are, without letting the first one erase the second. You're allowed to be here. You're allowed to let the good things land. You're allowed to take up exactly as much space as your life has earned you, which is more space than the system you came from was ever willing to give you. Jung called this individuation, the gradual, imperfect, lifelong process of becoming who you actually are, rather than who your past decided you were permitted to be. It doesn't require a Nobel Prize. It doesn't require an audience. It only requires, on an ordinary Tuesday when nothing is wrong and the day ahead is genuinely fine, the willingness to let that be enough. If this found you at the right time, leave one word in the comments. Just one. Whatever this brought up for you, you'll know which word it is. And if this kind of work is finding you where you are, there's more where this came from.